So far we've been discussing strictly engines, but airframes have very similar patterns. There are some key differences with airframes, but overall, there are some patterns that we can take advantage of. So we're using our knowledge about replacing engines to replacing airframes. Where we can overhaul an engine, we can do some kind of overhaul, some types of overhaul with airframes, but the general replacement strategy is to take an older airframe, sell it, use the cash that we have been accumulating and charging members for their use of that airframe, and then buy a newer airframe. The main pattern that we will see is that as we put hours onto an airframe, the airframe's value decreases. So on this graph that you see here, we can imagine the airplane when it's factory new, it just rolled off of the factory floor. And we can also imagine the airframe when it's essentially worth little. It's potentially just scrap, all right? And we would expect to see the value of the airplane span those 2 points. So let's do an initial approximation of that. Our first version will be a linear depreciation model where we have a straight line from factory new down to scrap, all right? And again, that represents the value of the airplane minus the value of the engine. The value of the engine is being handled separately. Where with an engine, we knew that the lifespan of an overhauled or factory renewed engine is about 2,000 hours. I'm leaving how many hours this is down here a little bit open. That can vary a lot by aircraft. My understanding, for example, is that pressurized aircraft have a lifespan of about 10,000 hours before the airframe has been worn out by the constant compression and decompression of the airplane. With unpressurized aircraft, it might be longer. Now, I realize this is not to scale, but I put some vertical lines through the graph here at roughly every 1,000 hours. We go a line at 1, 2, 3, and 4,000 hours. Now again, this is not to scale. This would strongly imply that the life of the airframe is only 8,000 hours, which is likely not true. But I wanted some room to work here, so I spread out those yellow lines a bit. The following information comes primarily from 2 sources. The first is our member named James McBride, who is a past president of the Ann Arbor Flyers, and the other source of this information is the club's old website, which kind of described a bit of the airframe replacement model. But as with a brand new car that you drive off the showroom floor, there's an initial big hit of depreciation. The airplane, just as the automobile, loses value very quickly initially, and then it probably joins some sort of steady state. So I'm going to draw that here with a red line. I apologize that it's not the smoothest here, but as you can see, as you have a brand new airplane, the value drops quickly and then slows down and ultimately joins the linear depreciation line. All right? And what's interesting is that the slope of this line represents how much you're consuming of the airframe's value at any given time. So in this portion of the graph, where the curve is relatively steep, we're losing a lot of value over a short period of time. When we go from this point to this point, we're losing much less value over the same period of time, 1,000 hours. As you go from this point to this point, again, we're losing little value over 1,000 hours. And then from this point to this point, it's getting steeper, and eventually it joins this curve, and we lose the value at approximately a linear rate. All right? Again, these are models. They're not perfect, but there's something interesting here that we want to look at. The key lesson is that from about 1,000 hours, which is about halfway through the first engine, to about 3,000 hours, which is about halfway through the second engine, this is the least expensive time in which to own an airframe because the value decreases the least per unit of time. And again, time is in the form of tack hours. So the club's strategy was to buy an airplane at about 1,000 hours, which is halfway through its first engine, and sell the airframe at around 3,000 hours, which was about halfway through the second engine. So this range here represents the time the airplane existed within the club. So again, I apologize that I'm not drawing the straightest of lines, but here we represents the point where we buy the airplane. This represents the point where we sell the airplane. And therefore, when we sell the airplane here, we must have accumulated this much cash in order to sell the airplane at this point, use the accumulated cash to return us back to this point on the next airframe. So the club has not been following this model recently. 37 Sierra, this is as of July 2019, had about, I believe, 2,300 hours on it. So it would fall roughly here. And actually, in about 700 hours would be the point at which we would sell it. All right. 39er Lima has on the order of 4,600 hours on it. So it's between the 4,000 and 5,000 mark. Has so about 1,600 hours more than what we would like to see. And 100 Whiskey is over here at around 5,100 hours, even further out. If the club has not been saving the appropriate amount of cash, we can kind of figure out where the club should be relative to where it currently is. All right. The basic idea is to figure out, say with 37 Sierra, what the current value of 37 Sierra is, what the value of a 1,000 hour Piper Archer 3 is, and then subtract those two to figure out how much cash we should have in order to return 37 Sierra back to this point with the replacement airplane. And the same thing would apply to 39er Lima. What would a 1,000 hour Saratoga cost relative to its current value? And we would see that it has quite a bit of cash to make up. And 1,9er Whiskey as well, 1,000 hour Archer 3 compared to where it currently is. And we would know exactly how much cash we should have set aside for all of this. Some have pointed out that we really don't want the club sitting on piles of cash. We want to use them, and that there's certainly a point to that. The problem is that we didn't have the cash, and for example, with 1,9er Whiskey, we would have replaced it about 2,100 hours ago had we the right amount of cash for it, and that cash would not be sitting there. It would have been spent at this point to bring us back to another replacement 1,000 hour Archer. Same thing is true with 1113 Uniform. That would have been replaced a long time ago, which was the oldest of our aircraft, the one that had the most tack hours on it. And the same thing is true with 39er Lima. If we had been holding to this particular strategy, we would not have piles of cash. Those airplanes, those three airplanes, 13 Uniform, 39er Lima, and 100 Whiskey would have been replaced a while ago. The final topic I would like to address in this video is, are there strategies that aren't replacement models? Is there, for example, a refurbishment model that the club could use instead of a replacement model? Well, let's think that through. All right, let's take 1,9er Whiskey as our example, currently at 5,100 hours, or at least as of July 2019, 5,100 hours. All right. If we just try to keep it refurbished and flying, it's going to accumulate more and more hours on the airframe. It'll get to 6,000 hours. Then we'll get to 8,000 hours, maybe even 10,000 hours. All right? And the value of the airframe is diminishing through all of that time frame. The question is, would you be interested in flying an airframe that had 8,000 or 9,000 hours? Could the club attract new members if our airframes had 8,000 or 9,000 hours on them? Or would there be other clubs with more attractive aircraft? All right, That's an issue we have to face. If we realize that a refurbishment is not a replacement model, is not a alternative model to the replacement model, then we have to always think in terms of replacement. And we have to figure out how we're going to get 1-9er whiskey from here back to a newer aircraft at about 1,000 hours, and how we're going to come up with this difference in cash in order to do so. If we fail to do so and simply kick the can down the road, we're not doing well by the club. There's no way around it. And the final point I would like to make is that if we are not putting aside the right amount of cash for the replacement model, then it essentially means that our club assets are declining over time, as we saw with the engine case. All right? If our assets were remaining constant over time, they would be following along this particular line here, where at the 3,000 mark, we could sell the airplane, get that value out, add this difference in cash that we've set aside, and bring us back to this point. So our assets were here throughout. And likewise, that would be true for each one of our aircraft. All right? But the fact is, we have not been setting aside the right amount. And therefore, rather than keeping constant assets, the club's assets have been declining over time. And that is a strong signal that the club is not doing something correctly with its long-term finances. And again, the longer we wait to correct that, the more expensive it is to correct that. And therefore, it's incumbent upon the club to correct this issue sooner rather than later.